Now, it's not a lot that we're talking about college football in late February, but when this news came out, what ends up happening is you start thinking ahead, Aaron. You start thinking to the playoff. The news yesterday wasn't surprising considering of the demise of the Pac-12, that a change would have to be made. But now when you start to envision on some of the issues that they could have with a 12-team playoff, even for some of the issues they had in trying to figure out where a 4-team playoff is, very interesting to see on how this will play out in about 10 months or so, because I think there are a lot of decisions right now that we don't realize will come into play in early December.
1,000%. Yeah, I was, and it's just you and I both love college football, so we've obviously been following all this, and I was kind of surprised by the reaction to this yesterday. One, I saw some non-college football people kind of surprised about the Notre Dame angle of it, basically because the top 4 seeds that will get that first-round bye have to be conference champions. It basically means unless Notre Dame joins a conference, they are not eligible to get the first-round bye. The counter to that is they don't have to play in a conference championship game, and I think everybody would kind of, you're going to have to win 4 postseason games one way or another. So that was one. But 2, I just find it so interesting because we decided to expand this playoff. I mean, we know it was really decided over money. But what we claimed at the time was, we need a national event that gets everybody involved. And now you're already starting to hear the rumblings that the Big Ten and the SEC, where admittedly most of the power in the sport is going to be, virtually all of the power in the sport is going to be, is already complaining about the fact that there are only 7 at-large bids, in addition to, by the way, the 2 automatic bids that the Big Ten and the SEC are going to get every single season.
Now, these 7 at-large bids and how they are determined, it may seem easy on the surface. But if you were to look at, say, what happened last season in the ACC, Louisville wouldn't have been an automatic team that would get an at-large berth.
Okay. Yeah,
and so when I hear about the 12-team playoff, the first thing I thought to myself, well, these conference championship games are pretty much obsolete, or should be obsolete, because of this is my initial thinking at the time. And I've changed over time for the fact of maybe Louisville plays themselves into the bracket.
Sure.
And all of a sudden you're sitting there and you're saying to yourself, all right, Louisville plays themselves in, but the problem is now all of a sudden Louisville, who was on the outside looking in, wins a conference championship game and is deemed a conference champion, and you now have Louisville as one of your top 4 seeds. That is not what the first round buys were indicative, or what we thought that how they would be used. If Louisville wins the championship game this past fall, it's not a big deal. They just go on and they get one of the New Year's 6 games, and it's quite a boost for how this ends up playing out. So that aspect of it as well, of just even of the seeding, I think is in question. If you're the Big Ten and you had a Michigan, Ohio State, 2 unbeatens going at each other, and all of a sudden, Michigan ends up winning the game, and so Ohio State's saying, "What about us?" And you have a Louisville team that ends up shooting up, and I would have questions about that. And there's just one of many, and I feel that I started by saying that I felt the conference championship game was maybe going to be obsolete. And now I almost think that it's a must-have if you don't penalize the teams for losing those games, which I think could come into play, which I think will be another issue that we deal with 10 months from now. How do you penalize a team for losing a game to a third-ranked team in the country or an unbeaten team if they are one of the top 12s? Or do you have the conversation, well, guess what? We know they can't beat number 3, so then they probably shouldn't have the opportunity to play in the bracket. I think these are all questions that are now going to be popping up when the selection process is done in December.
Well, when this all first started becoming a thing, that was my thought. I think conference championship games, I think, are a detriment more than anything. Now, people will say that to get one of those first round buys, you need to win the conference championship, and so that is where the value comes in. But, I guess there are going to be situations where there are, 3 teams at the top of the stand. Maybe 3 teams finish whatever. The SEC plays 7 league games. 3 teams finish 7-1. Like, there is a scenario where that can all happen, right? And it's like the team that somehow gets excluded from the conference championship game will benefit more than the team that wins. It's like, I don't know if I'm making sense, but I do think there are unintended consequences. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, can we use like Penn State as an example?
Perfect example.
So go ahead. Like just in terms of Michigan, Ohio State, let's say the top two teams of the Big Ten.
And they would play in the conference championship game, right? So that's a perfect example where this past year, Michigan beats Ohio State, but Ohio State's the second best team in the league. Now, obviously, the league's expanding next year, but let's put that aside. It's like if Ohio State loses that second game, in theory, they'll probably still be in that 12-team bracket, but you would think, okay, they lost at home to Michigan, or they lost on the road to Michigan. Let's say they lose 31-3 in the Big Ten championship game. They play a week later. Are they going to still be ranked ahead of Penn State, or is Penn State going to move up and Ohio State's going to be sitting there saying, we would have.
Yeah.
You're almost double penalizing them, right? Because if you win, you get this huge incentive, but you are super de-incentivized for losing. So I just think there's. Go ahead.
It's exactly what I thought. No, it's and you can keep talking. It's totally fine. That's why I didn't like it at first, because I thought that we focused so much in the 4-team playoff on the loss. And usually it was only one loss. A lot of the times, very rarely are we talking about 2-loss teams. And heck, this year we were talking about a no-loss team. But you would, as you're trying to split hairs and trying to find out who is better, we tried to look at, some of us tried to look at, what did their resume say? Who did they beat? Where did they play them? Who did they play? And instead it was always, and as an Ohio State fan, it was always, well, don't lose by 30 at Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
Don't lose by 30 at Purdue. Like that was the one blemish of them having a bad week. No matter what they did during that season, that was the one place to mark them down, and it was easy to decipher. There are going to be a lot of situations that are difficult. That's why I think it's imperative that the committee recognizes the value of finishing second in your league, or at least making it to that conference championship game, so you don't have a scenario like that. That's why I look at the committee, and it's different with a Louisville team that maybe came in ranked 14th. And by the way, I mentioned Louisville getting a top 4 seed in this. If a group of 5 was ranked higher than Louisville, they would be in. Like Cincinnati was, in the top 5 a few years back. Their group of 5, they would have been one of the 4 first-round buys in college football, in the new college football playoff. It wouldn't just be the 4 power conferences getting those first-round buys, but you would have that ranking, and if you're just going to determine it by the champions, Louisville could move up or just not be in the tournament at all. I do find value, because I think that the committee has to take into account, if you're looking at what was previously the Pac-12. If we just take last year as the example, you got to put Oregon in there. You got to put them in the 12. Like, I know they lost to Washington, and you're saying, well, that's not fair to Washington to have to beat that team 3 times in a season, but Oregon's body of work up to that point was of a top 12 school, and so you would have them in. You would have to put Ohio State in. Those are just the scenarios that I think the committee has the responsibility. So ultimately, Aaron, it may only come down to about 3 or 4 at-large bids if you take my thinking, and that the committee has to strongly consider, if you are in the top 12 entering the conference championship games, you should probably be there at the end of them, no matter the outcome.
So that's an interesting thought that I hadn't had, because a school like Louisville won't get the benefit of the doubt if Louisville's 11-2 or 12-2 after the conference championship, or whatever it would be, 11-2, I guess. I don't know, I'm bad at math. Yeah, 11-2. And LSU is 9-3. LSU is clearly the better team because the SEC is better. And I think that's where my frustration with, you can already see the powers that be starting to grumble. And this is where it reminds me of the NCAA tournament a little bit, is, one, first of all, let me ask you a question. Do you have any fundamental issue with the 5-7 model, 5 conference champions, 7 at-large bids, as opposed to just the top 12 teams? Do you have any fundamental issue with that?
No. Actually, I like the flavor of allowing the group of 5 to get in.
And that was the point I was gonna make. Next is that we were already starting to hear a little grumbling, and it's like, it almost reminds me of the NCAA tournament, right? Like the basketball tournament. Like, we get so worked up about 68, 67, 69, 70. It's like, whoever those teams aren't good enough to win it anyway. And like, for the SEC to already sort of politically behind the scenes to be complaining about 7 at-large bids, it should be the top 12. It shouldn't just be that. It's like, we're talking about your fifth or sixth best team. Like, in most years, the SEC is going to get a conference champion and probably 3 of the 7 at-large bids or something like that. There's never been a year where the 5th or 6th best SEC team can win the national championship, but they're already complaining about it. It just drives me crazy. I don't know.
No, there's also the fact of when you talk about scheduling, the Big Ten and the SEC, because of now the makeup of their leagues, are going to be able to provide a more challenging schedule than the ACC and the Big 12. So now you come to the decision of just take a 12-game schedule. How do you decipher between 10-2 and 8-4?
Oh, it's going to be huge. That's going to be the big thing.
Yes. And that's why I think scheduling matters. Like, I still think that we aren't going to be looking at the losses. We aren't going to be poking holes in the losses as much as we thought that we would be. You're going to have to look at the wins because that's that's truly the way, especially when you have such a disconnect. An 8-4 team may be stronger than the 10-2 team. And if the 10-2 team chose not to play anyone in their non-conference, that's their problem. If I'm the committee and I'm trying to figure out, and I don't have as much sympathy for the team missing out at 12-13 as I did at 4-5, in the previous regime. 4-5, it's difficult. 12-13, there's some leeway there you can work with. You win enough games, you play enough tough teams. Yeah, the ACC and the Big 12 are going to have to schedule out of conference because they're going to be at a disadvantage from the Big 10 and the SEC because the Big 10 and the SEC are just going to be able to provide a stronger strength of schedule or better resume to the committee.
No, there's no doubt. And I think that Louisville example is the perfect example of you just watch Louisville and it feels like they don't look the same as an LSU. They don't look the same as a an Oklahoma, maybe whatever. And that's where it's going to get interesting it is ultimately, there's going to be a committee, but we're going to kind of know what that group is. But I do wonder if forget the group of 5, but in the Big 12 and the ACC, unless that second team is a big brand like a Clemson or a Florida State or whoever that looks the part, like is the Big 12, if Kansas State finishes second next year, is the Big 12 going to get that second bid? They'll get the conference champion bid, but will they get that second bid when it's an 11-1 Kansas State versus a 9-3 LSU? I keep using that.
No, we'll take Penn State. And by the way, it's just easier to talk about the old conferences. Like we could talk about Oregon and Washington and the Big Ten and USC and UCLA. It's just easier for the sake of the argument to talk about the divisions.
When UCLA finishes in third in the Big Ten next year, what does it mean?
Yeah, no, I think that there is something to that, and that's going to be the question. But again, so if K-State wins that game in the Big 12, they obviously get in as a conference champ. Them losing the game, I don't think should be held against them. If they were in the top 12, in that case, I think that's where the committee has to decide, all right, well then this team is worthy. I cannot hold them playing a conference championship game against a better opponent because their resume up to this point provided enough for us to think that they were one of the top 12 teams or, the at-large, if you want to say the top 7 teams from the at-large pool. I don't think that they should be penalized from the loss because I don't think you should be sitting at home. Otherwise, then why do we have the conference championship game?
This will be the new debate, right? And it was funny because when we had the Florida State-Alabama thing this year, which was an incredible debate that people were very passionate about, I kind of had the thought of like, well, we'll never have that again. And we won't. Like, there will never be anything quite like Alabama-Florida State again. They would obviously both get into a 12-team field, both as conference champions. But it will be interesting, again, if an undefeated Kansas State team, let's just use the hypotheticals that we've had before. They lose. Utah's going to be in that league next year. They lose to Utah 40-3 in the conference championship game. It's going to be like you said, you had them at number 4 going into the weekend. Now you thought they were one of the 4 best teams coming into the weekend. Now you don't think they're one of the top 12. And that's where I could see on that Sunday when we announce the bracket, that's where the desk starts.
Their punishment would be to play in the first round. Their punishment should not be to miss out entirely. If you want to give any sort of consequence from losing the game that poorly, that's what the consequence is, which comes in turn with the game. You can't double down with that. It's too I just think it's
too
harsh
how
on the
we're
team.
already having the debate right now. It hasn't even happened yet, but it's good. But these are the debates that people are going to have. And by the way, I'm not even on the other side of you, But I did wonder, like in the 12-team era, are we going to be fired up about arguing about Iowa versus whoever for the 13th spot? But I think we're a society that likes to argue. I think we'll get there.
The problem with Florida State is Florida State did nothing wrong. I think in this scenario and that's why we would always focus on the loss. What did they do wrong?
Great
and
call.
how wrong did they do it?
Yeah,
there's going to be a bunch of wrongs. We're going to need some strength to be able to build this up.
Well, and that's where it becomes, the parallel with college basketball becomes interesting, is that last week we had the report that they're probably going to expand the NCAA tournament. And it's like, as somebody who follows college basketball, like when we get down to teams 66, 67, like they're not good teams.
No.
And so it's like, you and I have done the selection show for years. I don't think I've ever been outraged that Iowa State, and I'm just using them as a hypothetical, I don't even think they've been on the bubble, Virginia Tech, whoever. I don't think I've ever been outraged because it's like they're not good. Like you look at the teams that are on the bubble this year. Texas A&M just lost last night and got swept by one of the worst teams in the SEC. This is in basketball now. I know I'm switching back and forth. But I'm bringing it up because those teams aren't that good, so you don't feel that sympathy. And I do think we'll probably sort of feel the same about Team 11, 12, 13 in the 11, 12, 13 in the 12-team college football playoff, because there will be quite a few kind of bumps on their resume.